For one of our recent innovations, Buchanan's Green Seal, it was a different type of occasion, a more luxury occasion. So it was looking at the flavour styles that would be welcomed in that kind of arena, where it's where people are getting together to sort of treat themselves, have a really good night out with their close friends, and that's where we'd be looking at, the depth and the smoothness of the whiskey, trying to create a more luxury product that would be both deep in flavour but equally luxurious for that type of occasion. So it really depends, like I say, what's the current strategy on trying to either recruit new consumers like the Buchanan's Green Seal, or equally maintain the heritage of the brands as well. It's relatively well known that in certain countries in the world, the warehouses are very high temperature compared to Scotland. You might have a variation between 5 degrees and 12 degrees in your warehouse throughout the year. It might not be too much, but in India, it could be a climate where it's very hot at certain parts of the day or the year, even going from almost 0 degrees up to 45 degrees. So it can vary hugely. So very important when you're thinking about your product you're trying to make.
Wallace here, who's been working in Diageo. He's the master blender there. Webinar is about creating global brands and blending for that, right? So Craig, welcome. Why don't we start with a little introduction and more about your role, so that is the context for the room there.
Yeah, thanks, Sid. Yeah, so good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining at such an early hour, but hopefully it's going to be a really good session. So as Sid said, I'm one of the master blenders within Diageo. So I look after brands such as Buchanan's, Old Par, and also our new Chinese distillery, Yunto, as well as some Indian brands as well, such as Royal Challenge. So covering lots of different whiskies around the world, but based in Scotland, and look after the quality of the whiskey we make in our distilleries in Scotland as well. So yeah, hopefully going to be a good session this morning.
So let's dive right into it, Greg. Big picture, global versus local. So maybe you can give us a little context about how you're seeing things, trends. Are you developing brands for global, or are you still you focusing on a market and focusing locally? Like, what's the theory? How do you think about this whole global versus local picture?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the brand, but obviously we have global brands such as Johnnie Walker, and we have more local brands such as Buchanan's, which is more focused in the Americas. So you might approach them slightly differently, but the idea would be the same, that flavor is at the heart of everything we do. And what has happened in the past and will happen, I'm sure, in the future is lots of research. So consumer research, looking at the flavour trends that are happening across the world. So it's important to understand all the different trends that can be happening in different markets, and then interpret that data. So taking that data back to the blending lab and see what options I have within my stocks of whiskey to match the flavour profiles that are required going forward, and also understanding what is enjoyed in our current portfolio as well. So there's some very established brands and whiskies that have been around for hundreds of years. So there's something that we're doing right in those whiskies that we have to protect as well. So it's not just about looking for new things, it's about understanding what's working within the list of brands and developing that into new flavors and new innovations as well.
I would love to break this question into sort of two parts, right? So you said insights, and then you capture that, and then you develop a brand. So for a global brand development, I'm sure you have a set of questions. Maybe you can walk us through like some that it has to sort of fit into that criteria. And then a step further would be the local, right? So it can be and or as well, I believe, where, this is a must in your company. Like this has to happen for any brand, whether it's local or global. This is a maybe and thing. We can sacrifice this, but because it's local, it's an add-on, So can you give us some practical examples of those questions which you would ask in a brand?
So I think there's certain attributes that you have to have within your brand. So there's certain historical attributes that you want to retain within your brand. So whether it's the liquid or the pack or the marketing messages, there's lots of things that we look after within our historic brands. For example, Buchanan's is extremely popular in certain markets because of its sort of rich and smoky style. So we'd always want to protect that rich background in the blend. And equally, it usually has whiskies from distilleries such as Dalwhinnie, which is one of our most historic distilleries, and also been linked to the James Buchanan brands for many years. So there's certain things that we would always include in the whiskey, and I think those would be the two key ones: the richness, and then the sort of the Dalwhinnie style, the complex flavour it brings to the whiskey. So these things are really important, but equally, what's the new consumer wanting? So who are we trying to bring into the brand as well? So for one of our recent innovations, Buchanan's Green Seal, it was a different type of occasion, a more luxury occasion. So it was looking at the flavor styles that would be welcomed in that kind of arena where it's where people are getting together to sort of treat themselves, have a really good night out with their close friends, and that's where we would be looking at, the depth and the smoothness of the whiskey, trying to create a more luxury product that would be both deep in flavour but equally luxurious for that type of occasion. So it really depends, like I say, what's the current strategy on trying to either recruit new consumers like the Buchanan's Green Seal or equally maintain the heritage of the brands as well.
So, if I just go further into this, what does the process look like? You have a consumer insights team, which is doing data research, which is doing some test stores. So, how do you get that data?
Sorry, yeah. So we have our consumer insights sensory manager in each of our key regions. So one in North America, which covers North America and South America, and we have somebody based in Shanghai covering Asia, and then somebody based in London covering Europe and Africa. So those three sensory managers, those consumer guidance managers, they would look at local trends on sensory and on flavor, and they would develop research reports on various different brands, various different products, not just whiskey, other types of spirits as well. So they would be looking at all that detail for their market and then feeding that back into the whiskey specialist team in Scotland so that when we come to develop a new product, we've got all that data at our fingertips. And it can be about the actual liquid itself, or it can be more about the occasion as well. So for example, what's the kind of food that we go with it, or the occasion that's going to be drunk in. So all these types of insights are fed back into to myself when I'm developing a new whiskey, and this is where you get your inspiration from as to what you're trying to give the customer and give the consumer when you're creating the new whiskey.
How much of this has to be having a tailwind? So, it has to be a growing category. It has to be a growing consumer.
I don't think there has to be a tailwind because I think you have to look after what your core brands as well. So sometimes they will go through, peaks and troughs in terms of growth and then we're not doing so well. So I think it's not just about having the most recent trend. It's also about understanding the consumer. Make sure you're giving them what you've always given them in your core brands as well. And looking after those as well. So it's obviously better when there's a tailwind and you can find an insight that really inspires the consumer. But that can't always be the case. You have to be proactive and look for the next trend as well.
Understood. So it's mainly you're defining your ideal customer profile, occasion, all that is there, and then you're matching a blend for that later on then.
Yeah, that's what you're doing when you're creating something new for sure. You're trying to match the research that you've been given in your local markets.
So you got the data, you're making your blends and you come up with, let's say, 10 prototypes. What happens then? Like, do you send it back in samples and then again some case studies are done or research is done?
So taking the research, as I've said before that, in fact, where you take the research and you think about the flavors that you've got in your whiskey inventory and then assess the stocks of whiskey you have sitting in your warehouses all over Scotland. So, we have 30 malt distilleries and 2 grain distilleries, as well as other whiskies at our disposal as well. So we have to think about those flavour styles. And then within that, you've got the different casks as well. So within those 30 distilleries, they'll be getting put into 4, 5, 6 different cask types. So you've got to think about that step first and then bring in a suitable sample set from your warehouses before you create your prototypes. So it's quite a complex process. You could be bringing in hundreds of samples at this stage to assess. You'll assess those samples in flavour categories. So you'll group together distilleries into flavour categories at that point, and then use those bulk flavour categories to create your prototype. And then you get your 5 or 10 prototypes at that point. But you wouldn't, well, I wouldn't anyway, share the actual final prototypes until I'm down to maybe 2 or 3 options. I would rather narrow it down to 2 or 3 options within my own team and then share those with the local teams, the consumer guidance sensory managers, the marketing managers at that point. I've still got those other prototypes up my sleeve. They come back and say, well, actually, I'd like a little bit more, depth or a bit more mouthfeel. Then I might think, well, that prototype that I didn't share might be the one that can come back into the equation at that point. Or or I can learn something from those other prototypes that haven't made the final cut to then do the next step, which should be you take your one or two that you might have narrowed down to with the marketing team and then optimize that even more at that point before you might then create bigger samples to go out to consumer research.
Just curious, I mean, you don't have to disclose, but would love to know a process. Like, is it you make, let's say, 4 pallets of actual product with actual stuff goes in the commerce, and then do you have any cities or test stores or partners which give you further intel on how the depletion happened, how fast it got picked up, what's happening with that, and then you sort of go in your million cases sort of territory, is there particular markets? Let's say if you were targeting India, would you go in Mumbai first
Yeah.
with a couple of stores, and how is that process?
Yeah, I think yeah, we do that for sure. Yeah, so for certain products, we might have tested it in certain countries. So if it's a Johnny Walker new innovation, you might test that in 4 or 5 key countries that you think that have got big opportunities to grow the brand. So, and they might be from different parts of the world. So it might be Brazil, Eastern Europe, China, let's say. It could be all over the world, but you would test maybe 4 or 5 of those markets first with a few thousand cases, and then, like you say, if things go well, that's when you would then scale it up to much bigger volumes at that point.
This is a more technical question. That's why I'm going back to reading my notes. How do aging environments and destination climates influence blending decisions for whiskey sold globally?
Yeah, hugely. So, I mean, I think it's relatively well known that, in certain countries in the world, the warehouses are very high temperature compared to Scotland. You might have a variation between 5 degrees and 12 degrees in your warehouse throughout the year. It might not be too much, but in India, it could be a climate where it's very hot at certain parts of the day or the year, even going from, almost 0 degrees up to 45 degrees. So it can vary hugely. So very important when you're thinking about your product you're trying to make. So Scotland has very long, slow, gentle maturation. So there's a reason why we have to keep it for at least 3 years, because it takes that amount of time at least, and even longer sometimes to mature in our fairly cold warehouse environments. And our casks have to be very well looked after to ensure that they're always what we call active. So active means that they're always giving you wood flavour that you need. So in Scotland, we reuse casks more than once. So you have to look after your casks well to ensure that you're always going to get some good wood and maturation flavours coming out of them into the whiskey. So whereas other countries, perhaps because of the climate, the heat, you get a lot more extractives from the wood. So, as I mentioned, India, there's also certain parts of China where it's obviously very hot. Australia, the USA, you get a very warm climate for large parts of the year. So you get a lot of interaction with the wood, the liquids getting sucked into the wood, and then sometimes pushed back into the cask with the liquid expanding and contracting with the heat and then the cold. Lots of interaction with the wood. So in terms of actual flavour, though, for me the most important thing here is balance and not going too far with the wood. I think sometimes you can end up with a whiskey that potentially is giving you too much an overpowering mouthfeel, and I think that's quite often because of the wood. So I think you have to be very careful that you sample your casks regularly, and even more regularly when you're in a hot climate, so that you're picking the perfect point of maturation. You're not doing it on a time in your head that you might think is right. It's always got to be down to the actual balance. Almost ignore the time and just pick it on the flavour rather than the actual age of the liquid is the key for me. And as I say, it's the taste is the main thing. Getting that flavour and the mouthfeel balance well is the main thing for me.
Practical example, if you can share us one real case study where you identified a market, you did your ICP, which is ideal customer profile that you want to build a blend for, and then you sort of took it to the market. If you can walk us through some steps there.
Well, we've had a few. I'll talk about Green Seal already, so I'll talk about different Buchanan's product. We launched Buchanan's Two Souls a few years ago. So that was when we looked at a whiskey that was finished in tequila casks. And at this point, it was around about the time where the Scotch whisky regulations changed, and we're actually for the first time allowed to use tequila casks in Scotch whisky maturation. So even before this change had happened, we were looking at the possibilities of stretching the boundaries, and we felt like there was going to be some changes to regulations. So Buchanan's Two Souls was researched looking at how we can combine the culture of tequila with Scotch, and obviously with Buchanan's being so huge in particularly Mexico, that was a big opportunity at the time. So there was research done to look at the best way to do that and how to get the best balance of flavour. And there was lots of thoughts about how we should do it, and it was quite interesting that at the time, even though we were bringing in the tequila cask for a finishing process, so there's no tequila getting added; it's just the cask getting used. It was quite important to the consumer that it was still a very traditional Scotch whisky and a traditional Buchanan's blend. So we did research with lighter, sweeter blends, and that just didn't work. So the insights were that the consumer, although they were really inspired by the collaboration with Don Julio and Buchanan's, they really wanted the whiskey to shine through with just some background notes of tequila coming from the cask. So it took a lot of lab work, a lot of small fine tuning of the blend, but we got there in the end in terms of the the balance, and it was just a hint of the citrus and the charred notes coming through from the tequila, but it was still a traditional Scotch whisky. So it gave the customer, I think, a good balance, and it was a great kind of tribute to the culture and the fact that Buchanan's is the biggest whiskey in Mexico.
Just on that particular case, especially if there is any large company listening, there is a high risk. What if that new line extension fails or damages the credibility of an existing brand? I mean, I'm sure like at Johnny Walker level, you can't just come up with another flavor just and it afford a failure, let's say. So how do you decide whether to, develop something as a line extension for a biggest brand? How is that thought process done?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's research to sort of evaluate the risks, but you're right, there's always a risk. But I think at some point you have to just, obviously use your experience to evaluate what the risks are. And from my point of view, looking at the actual whiskey itself rather than the overall brand, my main thing is to make sure that every time we put something in a bottle, it's got an amazing flavour. But equally, our brand teams are very strict that they won't just innovate and innovate and innovate. They have to be within the brand identity and within the brand style and be the right thing for the brand. So there's a very strong sense that we're looking after the heritage of these brands. So over 200 years old, many of these brands are, and or close to that. And certainly that is a big part of the job for both myself and the brand team, just to make sure that we're looking after the heritage and we're not going to damage the long-term reputation of the brands.
Let's take two markets, which I would love to go deeper. One is a case study of India, and then the second after this will take China. So in India, as you just spoke before, like the temperature, the weather, the profiles, taste profiles are different. But let's take a market as an example now, right? How do you approach India if you had to start from zero?
That's a good question.
Like
So
let's say you don't have an experience of dealing with Indian market and you're ambitious, you want to export your brand or develop something for the Indian consumer.
it's obviously a huge market. You can tell that there's an absolute love of whiskey in India. And you speak to people who love Scotch whiskey, they're also very proud of the locally produced single malts that have been coming through in the past few years. So I think in terms of as an opportunity, I think again it's about the flavour profile, the flavour style that you think that the consumers like. I think historically with IMFL it was very light and there wasn't a huge amount of depth of flavour. Very good products and they are very popular products. I think they're just very accessible and that's a good thing. I think that initially when we were launching Scotch whiskies, it was almost do a similar style, do something very light and clean and not a huge amount of depth. But I think that the consumers potentially becoming is potentially evolving over the past few years. Certainly since I started working with India in quite a large way about 10, 12 years ago, and recently doing a study on Indian malt whiskies. There was a huge range of different flavors coming through. Historically, it would have been all about the cask. Put it in a sherry cask, lots of heat in India, so you get that flavor coming through. But there was such a huge diversity of different flavors coming through. So I think that's something to take note of and to use when I'm launching new whiskies in the future. Is that there's a huge range already out there now, whereas previously it might have been, like I say, the IMFL style or the Indian malt style with the kind of lots of wood flavour. So definitely something to take on board and to use when I do future blend development is that, depth of flavour and range of styles. The Indian single malts had a huge range of both distillery character, which obviously comes from the new make spirit that's getting made at the distillery. So they obviously must be experimenting with different yeasts, different cereals, different distillation techniques. I also, the that say that gave a huge range of flavors, not just the wood, and they're all as I say, they're probably experimenting with lots of different cask types to give a different balance of maturation. Whereas probably historically it was just using very active casks in the heat. So it's definitely developing, and as I say, big insights for the future.
I'll continue on this subject because I know one particular brand that did pretty good in London Spirits competition called Goda One, and I think that is a premium brand that you're trying to develop in India. But my question is now you are at the same time playing the game of making that brand and be a success in India, but at the same time making it an international brand like an Indian single malt globally, right? When you try to go into markets like India and China, do you want to win both, like make take the Indian single malt name outside and then at the same time penetrate, your other brands to the Indian market? How do you think about sort of which country and where there is a highest overlaps of taking them global and then vice versa?
I mean, I think it's definitely going to happen that it's already happening. Even that some of the global whiskies that have been emerging over the past few years are becoming out with their own countries. They're becoming better known. You mentioned Indian, definitely Australian. I think I can see Chinese whiskies coming through as well now. So it's very interesting to note that, and it's something that I spend quite a lot of time assessing. So I bring in samples to my lab of different whiskies to taste versus each other, and also versus Scotch and more established whiskies like Irish and American whiskies as well. So for me, it's about learning and about not sort of resting on what's happening right now and thinking of the future is the main thing. So it's about constantly trying to sample and taste these new whiskies that are coming through to learn about how they're developing. And I definitely think that in the case of Godovan or other brands, there's going to be a huge market internationally for these as well. It feels like they have their own identity. There's definitely an identity within Indian malt whiskey, and that's something that's going to be popular, and it definitely has its own place and its own place within the flavour wheel of whiskey. So absolutely, I can see that developing both in India and internationally.
On one side there is this, and then on the other side we're all going more local with the whole tariffs and geopolitical tensions and this and that. So, do you, based on your gut feeling, let's say, do you think it's much better to make an Indian brand for India, like made in India, Indian single malt for India, rather than having your, let's say, Irish brand exported to India? How are you adjusting your plays now for at least the bigger economies?
I think we'd want to do both. I think there's definitely a huge appetite for Scotch whisky in India. So I would say that still blended Scotch whisky is more popular than single malt Scotch whisky in India for sure. But that doesn't mean that won't change. And potentially with Indian single malts growing at such a fast rate that people will then want to experiment with whiskies from around the world to compare those two at a single malt category. I think there's definitely an opportunity there for both. I don't. I think they both go hand in hand. And I think people who love to try whiskies will love to try different whiskies from around the world.
Great. So now tell us a little bit about China, and then is there a case where you have one brand and then two different liquids for both markets, and why did you decide that?
So for China, we have Diageo. We've just over 2 years ago, we have opened a new distillery in Yunnan province called Yantou Distillery. It's an absolutely beautiful location. We're on the kind of west of China, and it's now going to have two or three other distilleries close by. So it's becoming a part of China where people are starting to build distilleries, but equally there's I think close to 50 distilleries getting built across the whole of China, either already opened or in the process of being built. So the whiskey industry is definitely expanding hugely in China, and it's on different scales as well. So our distillery is quite relatively small compared to others, but I visited one last year where they have grain whiskey, they have malt whiskey, they have a cooperage all on the same site. So there's people going at it at huge scale as well as smaller, more craft, luxury sort of size distilleries as well. So it's definitely becoming a huge area for growth. We're looking at, as I say, Yunto, which is going to be a more luxury whiskey, but for us, it's very important that we look at the local flavors and the local raw materials that we can use. To start with, we've been, importing raw materials, but we're actually developing new flavors through different research into yeast or cereals and also the local casks as well. So Yunnan is actually the most diverse place in the world for oak species. So we're looking at working with local professors and universities to look at what we can do in terms of developing Yunnan oak. We managed to get some quite early on in our warehouses, but it's quite difficult to get the right quality and to get the availability. So we're working very closely with the companies that look after the forests in a very sustainable way, so that we can source it in a responsible manner going forward, but also the right type of wood and the right flavors we're going to develop as well. So very important that we develop a whiskey that is both enjoyed in China and internationally, but a really high quality whiskey. So bringing in the flavors from the local environment is very important to us.
Understood. Now, on that example of same brand, but a little bit different variations, and if you can share us what is different and why that was decided.
I think within a brand, you can sometimes have different expressions. So maybe not the same product, and I don't know if that's what you mean, but it's not the same product, it's different brand variant, let's say. So Johnny Walker's a good example where we probably over the last 10 years have brought out a few different options where we have created a more light, sweet, vanilla style flavor for our whiskey. Things like Johnny Walker Blonde is one example of that, where it's very much using the flavors of bourbon casks maturation to bring a sweetness, a more accessible flavor style to Johnny Walker. Historically, like a lot of Diageo whiskey blends, Johnny Walker is a very smoky whiskey, well balanced smoke with other flavors, but compared to some of our competitors, definitely a smoky blend. Not as smoky as a single malt, but a blended whiskey with a reasonable amount of smoke in it. So looking at new consumers coming into it and giving them more options in terms of flavor. Some of them
Hmm.
love those type of blends, these more rich, smoky blends, but some of them maybe get put off by that. So Johnny Walker Blonde was one that was launched 3, 4 years ago. We had done a few limited time offerings in a similar style before that to test the water a little bit, and then we've now got this more established brand coming through, which I say is very good for lots of different occasions. Could be just drunk straight, or it could be good for mixing with cocktails and things as well.
Greg, on sticking on India and China, because I wanted to go a little deeper in providing some, more meat to it. Can you go back to India, let's say, and advise us how do you plan India? Let's say, do you pick like the big metro cities, or do you start with the smaller cities? And same concept will go in China, right? Like, is that the mid-tier cities you test and run, and then go to the big capital cities? And then the second is, do you just go with the highest traction of customers? Meaning, let's say, I'm just making up here, but I'm imagining it's 35 years to 45 years who have a spendable income, who have a decent salary because the product is going to be expensive. So, and that's your customer. Or are you just testing all everywhere? Like even being like something at $15 to $60?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's rolled out in these countries where it would be accessible to everybody, but certainly the big cities would get a lot of the volume of the product initially. So that would definitely be the case in India and China. Would be that we would target the bigger cities initially, but most of the time it's getting rolled out where you've got availability to buy it online and things as well. So it's available to everybody. But yeah, certainly targeting the bigger population areas first would be the first step.
I'm asking marketing questions, I understand, to the distiller, but because you are such a commercial success story, I'm sure that commerce and the real consumer questions are also part of the understanding the dynamics. So my question is channel, right? Like US, UK is very used to the off trade, on trade, very basic three-tier system, two-tier systems of distribution. The rules are set pretty much. But when you come Asia, there is this private label wealthy people on WhatsApp group buying. There is this direct omni commerces. There is WeChat boom boom action happening. So how do you design a label or a blend where it's just got so many different ways of consumption, and actually those are the main ways where the expensive whiskeys are being sort of ordered or consumed?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my job to do that, but certainly that is done by our sort of commercial teams as the how they're going to sell it, where they're going to sell it. That's all planned out in advance for sure. Sometimes you're surprised that it might become different occasion from what you thought, but that's not a bad thing as long as it's doing well. But yeah, certainly we try and plan in advance to target certain channels or occasions, but it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes you get a surprise and it's popular in different ways.
Especially if you're talking to young distillers out there, can you tell them what can go wrong, and sort of what not to do and what to do a little bit?
If you're talking from the blender perspective or distiller perspective, It's very important to hold your own values and quality to close to your heart, and very important to hold the line on quality all the time and make sure that you fully understand the target audience or the research that you've done. So it's really important to start digging into that research. That's one thing that I learned as I was developing as a blender, was that you have to really dig into that research, really starting to ask the right questions of the research, and that's how you can avoid things going wrong. Sometimes we get involved at the very early stage of the ideation for a new product, as well as being open to ideas. Having been working in this for 20 odd years, there is sometimes ideas that have been tried before, so it's important to step up at the early stage and try and be creative, but also at times be cautious with some of the ideas as well.
Do you personally, as a distiller, if you were working on a project, do you personally travel there, understand the culture, the food, the flavors and all that?
Not all the time, but yeah, certainly throughout my career, that's been part of it. Is through different stages, traveling to India, China, Latin America, and when you're there, it's important to try and immerse yourself in what's happening in the culture. So yeah, that's been a big part of my learning over the years, is to not only look at reports that come in and try and interpret them, but try and think back to the times when I was in the market itself and speaking to the people and speaking to the usually our innovation teams in those markets are people who are from that particular place. So taking away their thoughts and their ideas is very important as well.
Super, Craig. Just one last one on some takeaways to the folks out there for 2026, maybe. If you were to tell people that, hey, do this much or try this, or even anything like go this markets are important. Any intel that, would be valuable that you can share to us?
Scotch whisky's probably been in a bit of a downward cycle the last couple of years. So I think it's about being positive and remembering that these are cycles, and that whiskey is always in a cycle, and in the past it's always came out of that cycle in a stronger place. So be positive, keep delivering great whiskies, and things will start to grow again, I think, fairly soon.
Let's say 3 or 4 profiles of whiskey that you are seeing growth in, and maybe 3 or 4 markets.
Yeah, I mean, some of the ones we've already talked about, of course, the Indian market, I think that's huge. I think it's about when all the kind of taxes and things start to come down and all that sort of stuff. It's about being ready to go with the correct sort of whiskies and the correct flavors to grow in that area. So that's going to be huge. I think, as I mentioned, it's going to be interesting. Probably over the next 2 years, a lot of the Chinese distilleries that I mentioned are going to start to bottle the liquids. I mean, there's been a few already, but there's going to be a raft of these coming out. So I think to react to that, and to, even if you've got a whiskey from a different market you're trying to sell in China, I think it's about reacting to that and keeping an eye on what the consumer's doing with those new whiskies and how they're enjoying those.